So to get around this kind of time and cost and all those things that are problematic with longitudinal, what researchers will often do to save money and to save time and to avoid attrition and to avoid practice effects, they will use what we call a cross-sectional study. So what we're going to do here is we're going to observe different groups of different ages at the same time. Tell me how that works. How do I do it? Okay, I'll give you a longitudinal study. You tell me how I can make it a cross-sectional. I want to look at some kind of personality measure, and I want to see if it's consistent over time. And this is one of the things that the longitudinal study will give you, is stability estimates. You ever heard of stability estimates? Anyone ever hear of stability estimate? It's a statistical term. You get a correlation for it. You never heard of it? Anyone have any idea what it means, a stability estimate? If I'm looking at your performance from time 1 to time 2. Let's say I'm doing your IQ, and I measure it from time 1, so you're 5, and then I measure it again at time 2 when you're 7, and then I measure it again when you're, let's say, 10. So I've got 3 time periods here, and I'm looking at a stability estimate. What do you think it is? How would I get it? Any clue? I would have a measure at time 1, your measure at time 2, and your measure at time 3. And I want to see if you have a stability or a consistency of behavior, in this case IQ, over time, or does it change radically? I could look at the mean. So I would look at the mean. So I would have your mean, well, the mean of all 3, you mean? No, that wouldn't tell me anything. I would just give me your average IQ over 3 years. I want to see if your average, if your IQ is consistent over time. So I could look at your average, or like your score at time 1, and correlate it with time 2, and then correlate that with time 3, right? Would that not work? So if your IQ was, let's say, 100 at time 1, and it was 105 at time 2, and 103 at time 3, those are correlated. There's a relation. But if you're going down and up, right, there's no correlation. Or it could be a negative correlation. So this is stability estimates. Is it correlated from time 1 to time 2? Do they remain consistent? And those are called stability estimates. It's used heavily in personality research to see if traits that you're born with remain stable over time. This brings us back to a theme in developmental psychology we talked about earlier on. What is it? Does it remain stable over time, or does it change abruptly? Continuity versus discontinuity, again. And stability estimates would let you, find that out. So what I want to do here is, rather than take, these 7 years out of your life, I want to be able to test, in this case, let's say, IQ measures. And do they change from the time you're 3, 5, and 7? I don't want to have to wait 2 more years till you're 5, 2 more years till you're 7, get a whole pile of people in those groups. Hopefully they'll be around in each of those 2 years. So I'm instead going to do a cross-sectional study. What does it mean? What am I going to do? Yeah.
Are you going to take, say, 3 groups, and each group is a different age? Like, say you take a group of 5-year-olds, a group of 10-year-olds, a group of 15-year-olds, and a group of 30-year-olds.
Okay. Okay, so in my longitudinal study, going from 3, 5, and 7, I'm going to take, all at the same time, in real time, 3 groups. A group of 3-year-olds, a group of 5-year-olds, and a group of 7-year-olds. And I'm going to give them the same test. And I'm going to see if there's any differences among the 3 age groups right away. I don't have to worry about attrition. I don't have to worry about time. I don't have to worry about losing people, practice effect, none of it. But they're 3 different groups. They're not the same people anymore, right? 3-year-olds are going to be different than the 5-year-olds. What's happening right now in real time. Problem with this is what we call a cohort effect. What does that mean? A cohort effect. Let's make it even different. Let's say I'm looking at 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and 15-year-olds, and 20-year-olds all at the same time. What's the problem with this kind of cross-sectional design? Yeah. So it's a cohort effect, meaning your generation effect. So clearly, the people who are 10 years old, what I'm doing now is I'm going to make an assessment, right? Okay, 10-year-olds, have IQ, and clearly it's going to be the same when they're 20 based on this other group. Well, maybe not. Think about this. Could I actually compare you right now at, let's say, most people are between 18 and 25. Can I compare 20-year-olds or 22-year-olds in this group right now based on data that I have gathered from your great-grandparents when they were 22? And say, oh, this is how people learn. This is what their IQ is, right? Why not? It's the same age. They were 22 in 1940 or 50 or whatever, and you're 22. So why can't, you're still human beings. What's the difference in comparing those two kinds of people? There are environments such as, what could it possibly be? Huge one, right? I mean, huge one. Educational, pedagogy number one. I mean, you guys have computers, you have knowledge at your fingertips. You know, you're all getting university education. Your great-grandparents may not have even finished high school. My grandfather was pulled out of school when he was 7 years old to go work in a coal mine, right? So clearly, you can't compare a 22-year-old back then to now. 22 years old, if you weren't married with 3 kids, you were an old hag, right? There was something wrong with you. They call them spinsters. Now if you're 22, oh my God, you shouldn't be getting married. You're too young. Get your education, get a career. 22, in the old days, you were married and your career was being home with your child and being the good little wifey, right? So clearly things, you know, have changed, and you can't compare based on that cohort effect. So we have a problem here. And in the cross-sectional design, you can't look at stability estimates because it's 2 different people. So you can't tell at time 1 and time 2 if there's a consistency of a behavior when it's not the same person, right? So that's a problem as well. So one of the things we try to do to get around this cohort effect is, I'm just going to show you some pictures here. This is longitudinal. So here we have, in 2002, 6-year-olds. So both boy and girl at 6 years old. Then again, 3 years later, at 2005 when they're 9. Then again at 2008 when they are 12. So it's the same person. And here. And then we would compare, and let's say a stability estimate would be, is her scores here the same as her scores here, and the same as her scores here? And if they are the same, then they would be correlated, and that would be a stability estimate. If she was outgoing or shy here, and then she wasn't here, then there is no consistency of behavior, and the scores would be off, right? They would be different. So that's the kind of thing we look at for stability estimates of a trait. It's really important for development, because we want to know if you're born with IQ, or if you're born with a certain kind of extroversion or shyness, does it maintain itself over time? Or like Piagetian theories, are they stage-like and can be quite, take abrupt shifts? This is how we get at it. This is a cross-sectional. This is the actual one we just talked about that's doing it all at the same time. So 2005, all in the same year, you have 6-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and 12-year-olds. Problem is, it's different people, so you can't do stability estimates, and you might have a cohort effect. What she learned in 2005 might be different than what he's learning, at 9 years old in 2005, and you can't compare it to people, let's say, in 2020, based on 9-year-olds brought up in 2005. Different environmental situations. Okay. One of the things that we can do is a combination of cross-sectional and longitudinal. And this is the most complex one that we'll be looking at here. And this is going to be, again, a combination of the longitudinal coupled with a cross-sectional study as well. So we combine those 2 kinds of methodologies or designs. And in this way, it's going to avoid a cohort effect, and I'll explain how that works in a moment. But based on what we're talking about here, what would that be? A hybrid of a longitudinal and a cross-sectional study. What's going on there? Anyone got any ideas of how this is set up? Go ahead. Yeah. So it's a cross-sectional design right here, right? So we have all at the same year, the same testing time, 3 different groups, which is a cross-sectional design. But we're also going to follow them longitudinally. So we'll test those people again, let's say, in 3 years. So it is a hybrid of the 2 designs. The reason why it's beneficial is because if you can do it, again, this is going to be costly and it's going to be still prone to attrition and all the things that a longitudinal study can do, but it can alert you to any cohort effect. And this is how it does it. Now, this is going to be a little bit awkward. I'm going to have another thing up here that explains it better. So what you're looking at here is 2002. You have two 6-year-olds, and you test them again at 2005 when they're 9. Here you have a 9-year-old in 2002 at the same time that they were 6, and test them again in 2005 when they're 12. So it's a cross-section, but you're testing them again 3 years later. The way that you can look for a cohort effect, I'll show it to you on the next slide. Basically, here's your 3 different years. So you have one cohort who is age 4, second cohort is age 7, third cohort is age 10. All at the same time being tested at 2008. It is longitudinal, so you're going to test all of these 3 groups again in 2011. How do you think I could determine whether I have a cohort problem here? It's not going to eliminate a cohort effect, right? It's not going to rule it out, but it will alert the researcher to a possibility that there might be a potential cohort effect. How could I detect it in the data based on this kind of matrix here? Go ahead. The 2 that are age 7, right here and here. They're different cohorts at different times. I know it's kind of acrobatic, mental. You're exactly right. Yeah, go ahead.
Events going on in 2008 will differ from events that are happening in 2011.
And they probably will. And that's why we have to kind of be alerted to a cohort effect, which would show itself by having, let's say, if we assume that all people who are age 7 perform a certain way, right? If I show that there are large differences, like dramatic changes, between this person at age 7 and this person at age 7. There's something completely different about their responses. And I could also find it here, age 10 and age 10. What these people were doing here is completely different than what they were doing here on the same measure. If it's totally developmental and it's only about how old they are, then the performance should be the same. But if there's something radically different in their responses or their behavior, it may be a cohort effect. And you would have to determine if it is. Is there something going on here that may have affected the changes in this person at 2011? Does that make sense? Everybody get it? Hands up who understand this. Okay, good. We can also come up with what we call microgenetic studies. And this really has nothing to do with genetics per se. It's microgenetic, which means changes that occur over time, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to figure out a behavior or try and determine a behavior that we are very, very interested in, but we know when the actual change should occur. So we know, for instance, that children start to walk at about 12 months old, between 9 and 13 months old, usually for most people. We also know that language starts to develop at about 2 years old. 1 year old, they may start to just kind of babble, but around 2 years old, children start to produce sentences and are talking. Piaget tasks, so you look at Piaget's stages, he has age groups for each of these 4 different types of cognitive processing, right? Sensory motor, pre-operational, operational, formal operational, with each one becoming more complex when it comes to, let's say, something like problem solving. So if I know when a child is just on the edge of making a giant leap, then I might want to do a microgenetic study and watch the changes in that behavior over, let's say, the next 3 months to determine exactly when it occurs or how it's occurring. What are the changes in the way the child approaches the problem? So I might have a puzzle or some other kind of problem that I give the child and watch when this change, I expect it to occur, and see how the child verbalizes, how they approach the task. Is there a major switch over these next 3 months in how they do it, right? So that is what a microgenetic study is. It measures the developmental change when it is expected to occur. Can we think of anything that we know of with children? We all are familiar with children that something happens really quickly, and we might be able to do a microgenetic study to watch how it evolves or how it changes over this time period. What can you think of besides walking and talking that we know when it's going to occur? Okay. All right, walking and talking. Right-handed, left-handed, so we know that by about 1 year, children do show a preference for handedness, right? It's usually they're born with a preference, but initially it doesn't really play out. When they start to manipulate objects and the corpus callosum becomes more developed, they show a clear preference. So I might want to determine exactly when does this occur. And I would perform microgenetic studies, handing them things, seeing what they do differently during that period. Anything else? Think of anything else? How about reading? Reading, right? Writing. Doesn't usually take you 5 years to learn how to write. Usually it happens very quickly. Yeah. These people would have to probably be selected before the behavior occurs. They'd have to be equated on their ability. So you couldn't have a person with low socioeconomic status where the parents are off working all day and they're in daycare, and somebody else who has a nurturing. You couldn't do that. You'd be comparing apples and oranges. So you'd have to equate them on the measure that you're trying to do, for sure. The other problem with it is, yeah, it's costly to do this because you're trying to do all these studies very, very rapidly. But the other thing is, if you're trying to investigate a certain behavior, let's say problem solving, and I want to see how children make advances or leaps in the way that they approach a problem by giving them a series of problems over a period of, let's say, 2 weeks or 2 months. The actual experiment itself or the intervention itself may cause changes that are different than if they were to happen in the real world, right? Kind of linked to what you're saying, but this is now the experimental process itself changing the behavior. So if I want to find out what happens to a child's motor abilities as they're going from crawling to walking, and I think it's going to happen in the next few months, and I'm now watching the child, bringing them into the lab, watching them do things on, let's say, a treadmill, or watching how they walk across, some type of a track, and we have these kinds of apparatus to do this. And I'm going to be showing you probably clips starting in the next couple of weeks of how experimental research is done to watch the changes in children's motor behaviors. And they have all kinds of things that they devise. That intervention itself may accelerate the behavior or may change the behavior somehow as a child adapts and builds new strategies. Remember information processing? They come up with different ways to approach a task. So it may not be the same as if it were to occur in other 3 or 4-year-olds, right? Because this is different. Repeated assessment. Make sense? It's a kind of a practice effect.